You are listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai, and y'all remember 2020? We were all locked in the house, and somehow the one thing that united America, black, white, red state, blue state, was a mullet-wearing man in Oklahoma who owned tigers and ran for president. That was Tiger King. That was Eric Goode. Well, Eric is back, and this time he's traded big cats for something scalier. Thursday night, HBO drops Monsters of God, 5 episodes about the actual billion-dollar underground trade in exotic reptiles. Smugglers hiding snakes in their pants at the airport, collectors who will pay more for a rare lizard than you paid for your first car, and federal agents chasing all of it for decades. And get this, one of the central characters is the man who basically is already in our cultural bloodstream, Mario Tabrou, the reputed real-life inspiration for Tony Montana. You know, say hello to my little friend, Tony Montana. He's a part of this, and we can't wait to really get into this. Joining us, filmmaker Eric Goode. Welcome to A More Perfect Union.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here, Eric. When Tiger King dropped, you gave America sort of a shared, national fever dream during lockdown. Did any part of you think that, I'm going back to an animal underworld docuseries that was going to be the move after that? Did you think that that was the move that you were going to make, or did the exotic pet world just never leave you?
Well, listen, it was fortuitous to have Tiger King come out during COVID lockdown. Right at that moment, I had a captive audience watching captive cats, so no one could have planned for that. But really, I started filming the reptile world, and that's where I started. And Tiger King got in the way, and then another project called Chimp Crazy got in the way, and that's why Monsters of God took so long to make. It took about 15 years. But I started filming reptile people, and Mario Tabrou, the reputed or what people think was the basis for Scarface, as you mentioned. I was filming him because of his intersection with drugs and reptiles, not big cats.
Yeah, and Mario, he's real fascinating to our audience because his story, it sits at this intersection, Miami drug trade, Cuban exile community, the Scarface mythology that Hollywood built on the backs of real immigrant crime stories. When you sat across from him, did you feel like you were interviewing a reformed man or a man who just found a legal hustle that lets him keep the lifestyle?
Listen, it's easy to stereotype people and say this guy's bad, that guy's good. There's a lot of gray. Mario had a colorful, past, and I felt he was reformed in that sense. I didn't think he was going to be, at one time he was the enforcer, I think is what he said to me. That was his role in the, his drug empire. He was the enforcer. So you can, make of that what you want, what that means. But he was older when I interviewed Mario. Obviously, I was nervous in the beginning. It was hard to access Mario. It took a long time. But once I was sitting across from Mario, we had a lot in common in the sense that we both love animals. And he really does love animals. He may sometimes show it in the wrong way, but deep down, he loves animals.
Okay. I mean, I get that. I get that. There are a lot of people who are going to watch the series on HBO and are going to wonder, is reptile smuggling a rich collector's crime? Because when we think trafficking in this country, the conversation usually goes straight to who's in prison for drugs. Does this series expose a different justice system for people trafficking snakes versus people trafficking substances?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's 2 justices and many different justices for different socioeconomic groups of people, different races. The people that smuggle wildlife and reptiles included usually get a slap on the wrist or short sentences compared to those that are smuggling cocaine or heroin or other drugs. So it's sort of 2 justice systems. And you would think, smuggling in living creatures that might be dying in those suitcases, that might be incredibly endangered, should be a higher penalty than drugs, but it tends not to be. So there's different layers and a lot of injustice in the justice system, I would say.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I want to talk about the cultural and historical framing of this series. You trace this back to the Endangered Species Act of 1973. I want to give you an opportunity to, take our leaders, learners, and listeners to church for a second. How does colonialism and the extraction mindset towards the global South, how does it show up in the reptile trade? And, it's worth noting that a lot of these animals are coming out of Africa, out of Asia, out of places that already have complicated histories with Western collectors.
Yeah, it's messy, and there's a lot of exploitation. The source of the reptiles in Africa, in Asia, oftentimes it's people that are living, literally subsistence living on very little. And so you can't blame them for, taking an animal and selling it to survive. So very poor people in countries like Madagascar and West Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, where dealers get these people to, collect animals and then box them up, crate them, and there's a chain, just like drugs, of how the consumer in the end are usually wealthy people, privileged people that are buying these animals. But when you really think of the origins and then how many animals die along the way and the sadness and all of that, it's not a pretty picture. But on the flip side, I think that kids in this country should be able to have a pet lizard, a bearded dragon, a gecko, because that sort of instills a love of these animals. So it's complicated. All sides of this are complicated, but there's a lot of exploitation, I would say, in the countries of origin.
One of the things that we see in your work is this sort of empathy question that comes up. And you've said that you have empathy even for people doing wrong. You said that it's about the chimp crazy subjects. And you were buying reptiles from shady dealers yourself as a kid. What is it about you that lets people this deep into criminal enterprises trust you enough to go on camera?
Well, it takes one to know one, maybe. I'm not a traditional journalist, of course. I was a reptile guy. I was a reptile kid. I did a lot of things in my life that were unorthodox to get here. I don't sometimes agree with the laws that we have. I think there's, laws that probably should be broken, and then there should be things that we do in life that should have laws regulating them. So it's messy. I think that smoking marijuana should not have been a crime that put someone in prison for 10 years, 20 years ago. So I think it's complicated. I think that, I was patient to get in with these people, but once I had my foot in the door, I was fluent in the language. I could talk reptiles. I could talk in scientific names. There was a comfort that took over when people met me, and then they would open up and share their stories with me. But it took a lot of patience and time, if I'm answering your question.
And has it changed you? How has it changed you? Working on these films, having made that transition from being, a collector, some might call a shady dealer, once upon a time, to now being a non-traditional journalist. How has it changed you as a human?
Well, I was never a shady dealer. I unknowingly bought reptiles when I was younger from people that I was naive at the time. I didn't know where the reptiles were coming from. I wasn't as educated as I am today about the whole reptile smuggling world. But I have empathy for all sides of this story. There are people that are not as educated. They have to make a living. They found themselves in a place where they smuggled some reptiles. But then there are a lot of misguided laws that don't work when it comes to trying to protect wildlife. There's a lot of good laws. There's a lot of good intentions and a lot of unintended consequences that you'll see in this story. No one is perfect in this story. Law enforcement, sometimes has bad apples. The zoo community sometimes has bad apples. The reptile dealers are sometimes unethical. And the consumers that keep these reptiles sometimes often treat them like disposable pets. They buy a turtle and 2 weeks later it dies and their mother flushes it down the toilet. We shouldn't look at living creatures that way. They shouldn't be disposable pets. Your dog isn't disposable. You love your dog, but reptiles seem to be in a different category sometimes.
Mm, mm. Do you think movies, cartoons like Madagascar, shows like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, culturally, do you think that those movies and those cartoons, have they done any harm in terms of our inability to be able to see the the lives of animals, as worthy of more compassion, not less?
Well, Madagascar had a lot of animals that don't even exist in Madagascar. I've spent a lot of time in Madagascar. Madagascar doesn't have big cats and doesn't have hoofed animals. Madagascar has lemurs and reptiles and really interesting animals, but there's a lot of misinformation that is put out there from films like the ones you just mentioned. Films like Anaconda or Jaws show us a great white shark, 10 times as big as it should be. It makes everyone scared of sharks. Of course, so few people get attacked by sharks compared to car accidents and drug overdoses and all kinds of things that we do that would be much more harmful than going swimming in the ocean. Big snakes are not as big as anaconda. Snakes on a plane were all the wrong snakes. There's a lot, the Finding Nemo, the clownfish, everyone wanted to go out and buy a clownfish after that. Jurassic Park made every kid want to have a pet bearded dragon. Harry Potter, and the little owls in Harry Potter. I went to Asia shortly after Harry Potter, and everyone was selling these little owls. And I was like, what's up with the owls? And they said, oh, you want a Harry Potter bird? So pop culture has a lot to be, there's a lot to blame. There's a lot of misinformation that comes out of these films and pop culture, whether it's cartoons or scripted series, scripted films. So, there's, even Monsters of God may have a side of it that'll fuel the reptile industry versus teach people to be more responsible and care about these incredible animals. You can sometimes never control exactly the outcome.
Well, so let's have a little bit of fun, Eric. Rank them for us. Joe Exotic, Tanya Haddix from Chimp Crazy, and now your reptile guys. Who's the most unhinged? Who's the most dangerous? And who do you think secretly wanted to be famous the whole time?
Well, Joe, of course, and Tanya. I mean, that's why they talked. They would have talked to anybody. They wanted the spotlight on them. They were, Joe wanted to have 200 tigers, so he was the tiger king. Tanya wanted to have a chimp. It wasn't enough to have a squirrel monkey. She needed a chimp. And if she could have gotten a gorilla, she would have had a gorilla. But I think, remember, in all of this, Monsters of God, remember who the monsters are. It's us. It's not the reptiles that are the monsters. We're the monsters, of course.
Wow. A hot take right there. That's a hot take. That's a hot take. It's a hot take. Eric, in our remaining minutes, I've got to ask you this question about Bubbles because, Michael, the biopic, is, one of the biggest blockbusters among biopics in movie history. And one of the secret stars of that film was Bubbles, Michael Jackson's pet chimp that so many of us remember. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about how Bubbles showed up in that film? And in your view, what's the legacy of Michael Jackson related to Bubbles, who's living? We're made to think that Bubbles is fine. Bubbles is in his early 40s. He's living in a reserve in Florida. He's still taken care of by the Michael Jackson estate. Is that a demonstration of what it looks like to do right by these animals and treat them well?
Well, look, Michael, I met Michael many, many years ago. I've met Michael Jackson, and, he built a little zoo in Neverland in California. And Bubbles, in his early years, he loved Bubbles. But, like every story with chimpanzees, he got, older and the chimp became unmanageable. And Michael, donated it to a chimp sanctuary in Florida, and Bubbles living out his life there. But it's not a good story. Bubbles should be in Africa living with other chimps and not in a artificial situation in Florida. I mean, it's the best option for Bubbles. But these stories often end poorly. People buy a pet Burmese python and it's 2 feet long, and one day it turns into a 15-foot long snake, and they let it go in Florida, and that's why we have invasive Burmese pythons eating all the wildlife in South Florida. It's become a huge problem. What do you do with a chimp when it gets bigger, like Bubbles? What do you do with a python when it grows too big? What do you do with a pet crocodile or alligator? This country used to sell little alligators everywhere in pet stores, and they become unmanageable. It's a sad story because you buy something you think it's cute, like Bubbles. And I know people that knew Bubbles. I know Quincy Jones's daughter that used to play with Bubbles. Think about it before you buy these animals, because they're living creatures and they deserve more.
Eric, final question. Tiger King had helped pass the Big Cat Public Safety Act. What law, if any, are you hoping that Monsters of God moves? And for our leaders, learners, and listeners binging this weekend, what do you want them to walk away actually doing differently beyond just being entertained?
I mean, I really want people to come to their own conclusions when they watch my, documentaries. Yes, in the case of Tiger King, it changed the law, preventing people from breeding tigers and having puppy mills of tigers. And, the only good tiger is a baby tiger that you can cuddle and get a photo op with. And the big tigers, they would shoot them in the case of Joe Exotic. So it was a horrible business, the tiger industry. I'm not trying to be the animal police. And so reptiles, I do think if you're responsible and you want to have a pet bearded dragon or leopard gecko or ball python, I think it's okay as long as you take care of them well and really think about where they came from and try to be responsible. So I'm not trying to shut down the reptile industry. I'm just asking people to really think about it. They're living creatures, and just think about where they came from and how unique and beautiful they are. And I just hope people really enjoy the show and, learn something along the way while they're entertained.
Our thanks to Eric Goode, the filmmaker behind Monsters of God, the man who broke the internet with tigers, now wants to break it with snakes. Monsters of God drops Thursday, 9 p.m. on HBO and HBO Max. We will be watching.
Thanks a lot, Nii-Quartelai. Thank you.
You've been listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.